What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to SK Wealth Academy podcast number 10 And this podcast is entitled The Intended Purpose of a System is its Produced Outcome. Again, the intended purpose of a system is its produced outcome. Now, it's a pretty simple concept, right? Anyone with common sense can understand that if a system consistently produces certain results year after year after year, then that is its purpose, regardless of what the creators of that system tell us the purpose is. So I am basically making this particular podcast due to my lament of the eradication of common sense and of critical thought from populations. Because give me a child that's 5 years old to homeschool, and I'm telling you, I could take that child for 2 to 3 years and make that child a better critical thinker than 99% of the graduates from Oxford and Harvard University today. Because the academic system is not intended to make strong critical thinkers. That is not the purpose of academia. And again, if you the results of a lot of these graduates, if you test them for critical thinking skills, they would basically produce extremely low levels of critical thinking skills. So the outcome, again, relays the intended purpose of that system, in this instance being academia, which means it is to dumb down young adults, to basically make them weaker thinkers than they were going into the system once it spits that student out of the system. So let's get started. Please do subscribe and click the notification bell below if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on Apple iTunes, as I am receiving a decent number of downloads every single month, but yet only have 2 ratings, please do rate this podcast as well. So, give it a 5-star rating if you really love it, but I'm not asking anyone to rate it higher than what they believe it to be. So if you really found you've gotten a lot of value out of this podcast, then please do rate it 5 stars. Why? Because the 5-star podcast helps my podcast grow and helps it reach more people. So I really would appreciate that favor if you enjoy my podcast. So let's get started with the U.S. prison system. Now let's look at some of the stats, okay? In 2017, Black Americans represented only 12% of the population, of the U.S. adult population that is, but represented 33% or 1/3 of the prison population. Whites accounted for 64% of the adult population in America, but only 30% of the prison population. And Latinos/Hispanics represented 16% of the adult population, but again accounted for a disproportionate number of prisoners at 23%. So another way of considering these differences in race as far as representation in the U.S. prison population is by looking at the rate of imprisonment per 100,000 people. So in 2017, there were nearly 6 times more Black Americans in prison than whites per 100,000 people. And even among Black inmates, the rate of imprisonment per 100,000 adults in the U.S. population was still double the rate, but for Hispanics and Latinos per 100,000 people. But the really revealing statistic is the fact that they're imprisoned at 6 times the rate of white people. So again, there seems to be a very disproportionate number. Is there something in the racial composition of DNA that makes Blacks and Latinos more inclined to commit crime than white people? Or, as is the more likely explanation, is the prison system in the United States more biased towards putting people of color in prison versus white people. So in 2020, if you look at the rate of imprisonment in the United States, now a lot of people have heard this statistic, but a lot of people are shocked because they've never heard this statistic. About 1 out of every 4 people in the entire world that is incarcerated inside the borders of the United States of America, right? The country of freedom has the highest imprisonment rate per capita in the entire world, even higher than Russia. So Russia imprisons 615 per 100,000 people, and the US imprisons 737 of every 100,000 adults, which is insanity. Because when I get to the global pandemic statistics as far as the mortality rate, the global pandemic is only killing about 4 in 100,000 people. 4 out of every 100,000. So the US imprisons 737 per 100,000 people. So that's what, a rate 185 times greater than the number of deaths caused by this virus. So perhaps prison reform is a greater issue in America than this virus should ever be. Now, number 3 is Ukraine, and that actually falls in half because remember Russia imprisons 615 per 100,000. Ukraine falls to about half of that, a little more than half, at 350. And then South Africa is number 4 at 334 per 100,000. And then the imprisonment numbers, incarceration rates for other nations all around the world fall off drastically. I wonder actually even what the UK is, because the UK is not even in the top 10. And the 10 is Netherlands at 128 per 100,000. So again, if we look at the results of the US prison population, you would say that its primary purpose is to imprison people of color unless we can genetically prove that people of color have a greater disposition, something genetically wrong, whereby they're going to commit more crime. But if you actually know and break down the prison statistics, you'll actually know that there's actually a bias against putting people of color in prison in America, and also people of color receive much longer sentences for the exact same crimes as white people in the United States. So again, we look at the result. Well, that's the intended purpose of the US prison system. Okay, now we move on to the topic of wealth inequality. Okay, so if we look at the global financial system, the global banking system, everybody says, oh, everybody has an equal opportunity. This is a favorite quote of billionaires, like that mining magnate in Australia. What's the really obese woman? What's her name? I can't remember. But she's a billionaire. She said, oh, the reason poor people are poor in Australia, Gina Reinhardt, I just remember. So she said the reason poor people are poor in Australia is because they're lazy and they drink too much and they sleep too much. And so they don't want to work hard. And that's the reason she gave of why people stay in poverty. But if you look at, let's just first look at some of the indications of wealth inequality. Now, Ray Dalio, who is a famous hedge fund manager in the United States, said that the top 40%, and this was in 2019, he said the top 40% of wealthiest in America have on average more than 10 times as much wealth as the bottom 60%. Let that sink in. The top 40% of wealthy Americans have more than 10 times, not twice as much, but 10 times more. And he said more than 10 times more than the bottom 60% of Americans. And then when we look at it as well, in 2020, the wealth inequality became even worse because not the top 1%. We always say that term, 1%ers, right? The top 0.1% of households, of wealthiest households in America, had about the same equivalent wealth as the bottom 90% of America. So think about, there's 90, there's 10%, there's 1%, and there's like 0.1% had the same wealth as 90% of the rest of American households in 2020. And Credit Suisse Global Wealth always puts out a global wealth report every single year. And in 2019, they said 47 million people, or less than 1% of the world's population, owns 44% of the entire wealth. So we see the great wealth inequality and great wealth disparity also translates outside the United States. It's just not within the borders of the US, but it's for the entire world. And that Global Wealth Report also reported that less than 10% of the world's population own 83% of the total global wealth. So it didn't really get much better even after we expanded from the 1% to the 10%. So basically that means 90% is just left to fight over 17% of the wealth in all the wealth in the entire world. So and I actually believe that these figures are significantly underestimated, meaning that it wouldn't surprise me if it's more like 5% of the world's wealthiest population owns 90% of the entire wealth in the world. Why would I say that the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report most likely significantly underreports real statistics? Is because, first of all, we've all heard that saying that the wealthy make it a point to own nothing. So, because that's one of their favored tax avoidance tactics, to avoid paying tax on their wealth. They basically hide everything either in shell corporations under different people's names, not their own names. So the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report always draws their conclusions from publicly reported tax documents. So we all know that the billionaires hide the majority of their wealth. Does not come under any type of filing under tax documents. So most likely they have far more, the wealth is far more concentrated at the top than that exposed through publicly filed tax documents. Now in 2019 as well, the OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, stated that the middle class had been shrinking in 40 countries for every generation since the baby boomers. And said living standards as well for the middle class has been declining over the past 3 decades for these 40 nations, which included South Africa, China, Russia, and Brazil, and the 36 nations that comprise the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which include every single major global economy in the world. So of course it would include like the UK, US, Canada, Germany, France, Spain, and so on. So again, we see the concentration, we see wealth transference patterns just migrating to the 0.1 top percent of the world, and yet at the same time we see other organizations reporting that the middle class around the world is shrinking. And what do we all know we need for healthy economies in every nation, right? We need like that bell curve where there's a very substantial, most of the bell curve should be comprised of the middle class for a strong economy. Then you have your outliers of extremely wealthy people, and you have your outliers of poor people. And that would always happen even if the global financial systems gave everyone a fair shake, even if everyone started at the same starting line, which is not the case by a long shot today. So instead, we have the most important pillar of a healthy economy in every nation in the world vastly shrinking. Now, what defines the middle class? That is a problem, because there are a million ways surveys define middle class. From the least accurate definition, probably when I scroll through some of these surveys, probably being used by the Pew Foundation, which is a famous research organization in the United States. Are always putting out and compiling research and surveys and reports, and they basically just ask people to self-identify as middle class. So we all know that's probably that even these definitions of shrinking middle class are probably are underreported. I mean, it's probably shrinking to a greater degree, because when we ask people to self-report, people don't like to report themselves as poor, right? So there's probably a lot of families and households that are borderline poor would really belong more appropriately in the poor category, that are going to self-report as, yes, a middle class. And then there are other surveys that tightly define the middle class just as households, for America this is, that earn between $40,000 and $200,000 annually, with basically surveys using every other definition in between that very tightly defined parameter for the middle class and the very loosely defined parameter for the middle class is self-identification. So I'll give you one other definition of the middle class provided by the Brookings Institution, which is a well-known U.S. think tank. They say in 2016, any household that earned $12 per person per day qualified as middle class, a definition with which nearly every sane person would disagree. If you just earn $12 a day in a household, so even if you have three people in the household that are working, that's only $36 a day, and you're defined as middle class? I don't think so. So again, these surveys that also, when I look at the predominant number of these surveys that say the middle class is severely shrinking, I think they're reporting the shrinkage of the middle class enough, because some of their definitions for middle class are absurd. And it seems like that the shrinkage of the middle class has been far greater than what is being reported, especially since 2008. And just to prove that people, as far as the self-identification parameter being a horrible way to identify how many people are middle class in the US, and by my explanation that people always identify themselves as a higher class than they actually are. So if they're middle class, they may say, oh, I'm in the high class of society, or if they're poor, they may move themselves up and self-identify as middle class. Because in 2007, CBS, which is a major US television station, conducted a poll. And again, they asked people whether they consider themselves to be middle class. And 90% of Americans that were polled identify themselves as middle class, which would mean that we should still have a very robust middle class, even with the central banking destruction of American income since 2008. We should still, if 90% of the people before the 2008 global financial collapse in America were middle class, we should still have an extremely healthy middle class, but that is not the case. So in regards to who did I tell you defined middle class by income? I can't remember what surveying group it was, but it was a very well-known surveying group as well. By defining middle class by income, that is a horrible way to define middle class as well, because the last time I was living in LA was about 15 years ago, and I earned six-figure salary. That barely put me in the middle class, because the cost of living in Los Angeles is so expensive, and the tax rate is so high in California, it's the highest in the entire country, that by the time, I wasn't even living large. You pay for all your expenses. You're lucky even earning six figures, if it's low six figures, because I wasn't earning like $500,000. I wasn't at mid six figures. You're lucky to be able to save just a few $1,000s every year. So that would barely qualify you as middle class. But I saw surveys a few years ago even that were defining the upper end, the very upper end of the middle class as those that earn $74,000. So basically, it depends where you live. You just can't use income as a blanket parameter for defining middle class. And then you can't leave that, like a lot of times people say, okay, middle class is earning between this and $74,000. But then they leave that upper end parameter of $74,000 for years and years and years upon end, and they don't properly adjust that for inflation, because as inflation destroys purchasing power, you have to keep ratcheting the upper end up to 80,000, 85,000, 100,000, 110,000. So again, when we all say, hey, US is the model of capitalism around the world, does this sound like capitalism to you, when all the wealth is getting concentrated in the 0.1% and the middle class is being devastated? What are these? These are the results, right? People will always say the US is the model of capitalism. But these results, and they've consistently been this way for more than half a century now. Where do we typically see such inequitable distributions of wealth? In societies that practice capitalism? No. In communist nations, right? Not even in communist nations that are more open to capitalism today, because there are some, nations that still identify as communist, but really it's a mix of communism and capitalism. It's not pure communism. But in nations that practice pure communism, say Cold War Russia, right, back in the 1980s, that was the type of inequitable distribution or inequitable patterns of wealth distribution we are witnessing in America now that identifies itself as a capitalistic society was more reflective of the communist society we saw in Cold War Russia in the 1980s. So that should make you think, are we really living under a capitalist system? Because the results do not match the definition. So I would say definitively no. The U.S. is not a capitalistic society. Although people always want to, say, "Oh, I learned that in business school," or the mass media tells me what to think, so that's what I think. Now let's move on to central banking. Now, tell me how anyone with even the smallest sliver of intellect can believe the nonsense written into academic textbooks all around the world, and even on the official central bank websites, which to this day still say that their purpose and their mission is to produce price stability among the domestic currency in their nation. So if we just look again at the results, right, the euro has hardly been the model of price stability, if that's what the European Central Bank is touting on their website. And sometimes the euro has even lost 25% in purchasing power against the US dollar in very condensed timeframes. And timeframes are just several months. Since its inception, I believe the first euro note was printed in 2001. So, it's barely been 2 decades and already the euro is just hanging on. And the US dollar, since the inception of the US Central Bank in 1913, has lost more than 98% of its purchasing power. So here's why, again, where I say we have a system that has existed for more than 100 years, and we see the results have been consistent. Right? The US dollar is consistently losing price stability, losing purchasing power. In fact, it almost lost all of it already since this purchasing power in 1913. So how can anyone of any intellect say that central bankers put the best interests of the citizens at heart? Because I could care less what they say. Anyone that really wants to understand the truth, if you're honest and sincere about that goal, you will start looking at the results these institutions produce and understand that is their purpose. Stop listening to the words, just like we say with politicians when they're running. Stop listening to their words. Listen, just look at their actions. So look at their past history, how they voted. Stop listening to their words. If they say they're going to help this group or that group, look at their actions. And then when they get in office, their actions hardly ever are consistent with the promises they make during their campaigns to get elected. So we know that these politicians are frauds. Just look at the result. And I'll give you another example. Look at the Swiss National Bank. Now, the Swiss Constitution required for decades a Swiss franc to be backed by a minimum of 40% gold. But central bankers totally destroyed this constitutional protection granted by the currency to Swiss citizens in May of 2000 because Europeans were increasingly hoarding the Swiss franc over other currencies, as Gresham's law states. Bad money chases good money out of the system. So people were hoarding the good money, Swiss franc, over the euro. And that was due to the Swiss franc being possessing the solitary status of the only currency that was still backed by gold reserves, even though it was just partially backed. And the ties of the Swiss franc being backed by gold reserves dated back to 1865. That's correct, 1865. And endured numerous attempts to ban his gold banking and supersede Swiss constitutional law. Because again, this was written in their constitution that the franc must maintain a minimum of 40% gold banking. But in 2005, the Swiss National Bank expedited its attack on the Swiss franc by selling off national gold reserves, further destroying its gold banking. And then finally in 2011, despite the prior measures taken by central bankers to destroy the purchasing power of the Swiss franc whenever possible, even though people to this day inexplicably still believe that the purpose of central banking is to uphold price stability of currencies. In 2011, because the Swiss franc nearly reached parity with the euro, almost was trading at a 1-to-1 ratio, which was an unacceptable outcome to the parasitic banking class for another currency to challenge the supremacy of the euro in the EU. So consequently, the Swiss National Bank bankers intervened and stated on September 6th, 2011, that from that date forward, the Swiss franc would trade no less than 1.2 to 1 to the euro. And upon their declaration, the Swiss franc crashed by nearly 10% against the euro in just a matter of minutes, which horrified Europeans that had bought the Swiss franc because they believed it would be a safe haven currency because of its gold banking. So again, when we look at the results of the central banking system, which has always been, the results have always been the great destruction of purchasing power of currencies in every single nation in the world. Only a fool would believe that the purpose of the system is what the central bankers state it is. Now let's finally wrap this up by looking at the pandemic. So what do they say the purpose of all these global economic lockdowns that are still ongoing? What does every politician at every level say, besides maybe a handful that have come out against these lockdowns? I think I could think of and this includes presidents, prime ministers, and those at the regional level, governors, those at the more local level, like the metropolitan level, being mayors. I could just think of the number of any of those politicians at any level and count on one hand those that have come out against the global pandemic lockdown. But what do the vast majority, 99% plus of all these politicians say the reason for executing this global lockdown is they always say it's to protect our health, right? We can't let our health systems be taxed by so many people getting sick within our nation, and without the strong health of our citizenry, then we can't be a productive society and we can't be a strong economy. So our number one goal is always to protect the health. That's all we hear, right? But what nations have reported the highest numbers of infections and deaths from the virus? The nations with the strictest lockdowns, right? Like US, Brazil, UK, and Italy. Those are 1, 2, 3, 4. So in addition, Brazil, which also enforced very strict lockdowns, is one of the poorest nations in the world with poor sanitary conditions, poor health care for those living in poverty. So, you would expect the rate of deaths to be very high in a nation with extremely high poverty rates, poor sanitation, and poor health care. So generally speaking as well, it's not a good idea to lock down infected elderly, the most vulnerable, in nursing homes so they can all infect each other and all die together. It's not even proper quarantine procedures for the vulnerable, and those types of mandates were executed both in the US and in Italy. So it's more like a formula to ensure that they die. Look at the results. In any event, look, if we look at the result, okay, currently we have a death count that has zero scientific credibility, zero, and it cannot be trusted because, again, we do not know how many people have died in any country that has been healthy, that has not had an immunocompromised system. There have been people that have been reported saying, oh, this person was only 30, he got infected with COVID and then died, but then we find out, oh, that person had some type of chronic ailment like leukemia or something. So they were very vulnerable to the virus. So I'm not saying the virus is not serious. It does even seem to be more serious than the flu, but only to the vulnerable. So that's only a very small segment of the population. So let's sum up the deaths from the top 5 affected nations. Because after the top 5 nations, the number of deaths in nations dramatically drops off. So the top 5, if you sum up the number of deaths, amounted to 268,812 deaths. But as of June 20, I think it was June 19th or June 20th, but I would conservatively estimate only 70% of these deaths, just to say pure COVID deaths. And that's probably even an overestimation because of the way the statistics are compiled, because of the methodology of compiling statistics has very low robustness, which this does. If you go look at how these death statistics are being compiled all around the world, the robustness is unreliable. So that makes all the statistics unreliable. But let's just say, okay, let's estimate 70% are really just pure COVID deaths. So that's 188,000 people in the top 5 countries. Might seem like a lot, but given the global population of 7.8 billion, it's not that many. So even if let's take 70% of all the reported deaths, not just from the top 5 countries. So all the reported deaths is about 450,000 people. You take 70% of that, you know what that translates into the mortality rate? 0.004%, or just 40 per every million, or 4 in 100,000. Now, chief economist with the UN came out earlier this month, and he is associated with the UN World Food Program. He has estimated that given the fact that 135 million people in this world are already on the verge of starving to death and live in acute hunger on a daily basis, and this is affecting them, of course, the greatest amount. And he said that number will probably double. So he said by the end of the year, 265 million people in the world could starve to death as a direct result of these pandemic lockdowns that are being enforced. So that figure translates to a mortality rate of 3.4%. Now let's cut that rate by 30%, because we all know sometimes these estimates are way off. So let's bring that down to just 70% of that estimate. So now we have a lockdown starved to death mortality rate of 2.38%, cutting it by 30%. So even this mortality rate is roughly 600, that's correct, not 6 times, 600 times greater than the deaths produced by the pandemic so far. So through financial ruin imposed by the global pandemic lockdown, all these rulers of the political parasite class will kill. They're going to basically enforce genocide around the world, because they're going to kill 600 times more people than the virus has killed on its own so far. But guess what? All these mayors, governors, presidents, and prime ministers, but like I said, but just a handful, people you can count on one hand, are on board with mass genocide through the lockdown. So of the people that will survive this global pandemic lockdown, the UN labor body expects 6.7% of working hours to be wiped out this past second quarter. And that is the equivalent of 195 million jobs worldwide that have been lost. So that estimate they figure to be pretty accurate, because the second quarter is already almost over. We're just a week away from it being over, and they've been compiling statistics. So there's not many estimates involved in that. So let's say we take only 70% of the estimated numbers that will starve to death because of the parasitic rulings classes pandemic lockdown for our own good. So instead of the 260 million people that United Nations estimates will die as a direct result of the pandemic lockdown, let's just say only 186 million people die from starvation, which, by the way, is a horrible, extremely painful way to die, because your body basically just eats itself, and that's how you die from starvation. And another 195 million have already lost their jobs, according to the UN. But let's ratchet that up, because we all know that nobody around the world is saying that businesses will open up 100%. They're saying some businesses can only open up 50% capacity, like restaurants. So a lot of other businesses that haven't gone under yet will go under. A lot more people will still lose their jobs, because a lot of small businesses, they can't survive operating at 50% capacity. And in fact, because they've had no income for 3, 4, 5 months now, they're going to need to operate at 100% capacity just to survive. So we all know more jobs are going to be lost. So let's ratchet that number up by another 20%. So conservatively, I think that's a conservative number. Now, 235 million people worldwide will have lost their jobs because of this global pandemic lockdown. So the lockdowns implemented worldwide will either kill, because people will starve to death, or financially ruin. And these are conservative estimates, because remember, I ratcheted down the starvation estimate by 30%. So that's 186 million plus 235 million that have lost their jobs, or 421 million people worldwide that will either die or be financially ruined. And that is a rate of 5.4%. Now remember, the global mortality rate for the pandemic, people that died, is just 0.004%. So in other words, at 5.4% of people dying or being financially ruined as a result of this lockdown, 1,350 times more people will be forced into an extremely painful death or financial ruin than the number of people that have already died from this virus. And the parasitic ruling class thinks this is a wonderful idea. So when the result of the lockdown, this is the result. Well, actually, it has not happened yet because some of those are based upon UN estimates as far as those that will starve to death. But if this happens, because it hasn't yet fully materialized, if this happens, and 1,350 times more people are negatively affected, I mean, not just negatively affected, but financially ruined or die from the lockdown measures, than the actual number of people that die from the virus. What do you think the true purpose of these lockdowns were? That's if those are the results, what do you think? I mean, it's unbelievable to me that people cannot see through because the parasitic ruling class is not even trying to hide it. Now, here's one really interesting thing. Is that someone commented, I think it was on podcast number 108. So why have the Chinese been so extreme in their lockdown? You know, because we've seen all these videos online when it first happened, people being sealed into their apartments, can't leave, people being hauled off the streets, thrown into the back of trucks, locked up and never seen again that were affected. Well, think about this, because the US and China is in a trade war, right? Could this all be an exaggeration to ruin? Could it be a strategy? Because remember, even though Osama bin Laden, a lot of people don't know this, because the FBI said there was no proof Osama bin Laden was part of the plot behind 9/11, but he came out and he did say that as far as he was concerned, because the U.S. was an enemy, because they were in bed with Saudi Arabia, who he felt the royal family sold out to America. So he wanted to punish America. But he said that the more appealing result from 9/11 to him, more so than the deaths of how many? It was like more than 3,000 Americans died in the Twin Tower collapses. He said more so was the economic devastation that followed. So think about it. If you're engaged in a war, would you put out false information so that other countries react, shut down their borders, and you can wage an economic war through disinformation campaigns? Just think about it. Maybe that's what China, I'm not saying I have any proof, that's what China's doing, but maybe they're smart enough that that's how they're attacking and winning an economic war, just through disinformation. It is a possibility. Okay, so that wraps up the podcast number 109 for today. It's a little hot in here, so that's why I've been rubbing. I've been a little sweaty. But in any event, I hope that this podcast has really made you think, because that's the purpose. I want people to think instead of to stop blindly accepting what people in positions of authority tell us. This is the purpose of this system. This is the purpose of this system. We have capitalism in this country. We have, if the results do not match what you know the system should produce, then either that system is not in place, we're being lied to about what the system is, which of course is happening with free market capitalism. There is no free market capitalism even in any European nations, let alone the United States, because you look at the results, they reflect more of the wealth inequality of Cold War Russia. So that's really more what the system is in America versus free market capitalism. And then if we look at results of certain systems, and we keep hearing like central bankers say, hey, this is what central bankers looking out for you, Mr. Joe and Jane citizen, but you keep seeing purchasing power of currency being destroyed, you know that is their mission. And it's not like it's not like it just happened 1 year, right? Because then you can say, oh, we don't have enough evidence that this is really the purpose of the system. But we're talking for central banks, we have centuries of data. So how can people still be falling for this? It's inconceivable to me. But hopefully this will spark some conversations among you, your family, your friends, your coworkers, your colleagues. Pass this on to anyone that you think might enjoy this and might think about things instead of just blindly believing what they're told to believe. Okay, so thanks so much for watching. Again, if you want to contribute and help me produce podcasts like this, because Again, I've been demonetized by YouTube forever. Google took away all my ad revenue. I actually had thousands of dollars on my news site of ad revenue, Google ads owed to me like years ago, and they just wrote me an email saying, your blog does not fit our specifications for advertisements and we are not releasing any of your Google ad payments due to you. So this is the parasitic ruling class. If you want to fight against them, help me in this fight. Help spread the word about my podcast. Help send it to other people. And thanks so much for watching, and always remain intensely curious. Until next time, stay safe, build up your community, build up a tight community with your friends and your family, your loved ones, and even your local community. Because we're all going to need this in the second half of 2020. And take care.